ladies and gentlemen, dear Mrs. Godard, I hope you had a pleasant lunch. It's time now to get into our topics of today, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here at the Martens Centre for European Studies. My name is Peter Hefele. I'm the Policy Director of the Centre. And we are here together on a debate on better regulations, the influence of bureaucracy reconsidered. And let me start with thanking our partner, the Ludwig von Mises Institute Europe. Mrs. Goddard, we are very pleased with you and your colleagues to get these things done. Well, today we are about to discuss bureaucracy, and we will not do it in an abstract or an institutional setting, because it's something which our citizens are dealing with every day, and they are not interested very much in legal theory or in governance model. They think, if they think about bureaucracy, about forms that never end, rules, these are hard to understand, obligations you feel, and if you don't comply, often there's a fear of getting something definitely wrong. Let me start with a number and putting it on the table. In Germany alone, we calculate that the bureaucracy costs might be roughly 150 billion euro per year. And this is not theoretical money. It's money which we cannot invest, which we cannot put into innovation processes, and not often creating even jobs. And Germany, despite being the largest country, is not the only one. We have 27 member states. And you can do your math, indeed, how much this will cost at all. And, well, the numbers of directives of regulations on the European level has, at least during the last legislation, has reached record levels, and sadly it continues, by the way. So why does it matter to cut into bureaucracy? Let me share a few thoughts as an introduction of this topic today. Well, those who had already dealt with this topic many years ago remember, for example, in 2008, the European Union launched already an initiative, what it called at that time Better Regulation Agenda, and the promise was roughly the same as today. It was fewer burdens, better rules. Well, that sounds. Let's us jump to the present here. Bureaucracy has definitely not gone down. Rules have become longer, more technical, more detailed, harder to understand, and in many cases even harder to apply in praxis. And if we look a bit beyond the sheer numbers, which might have decreased, what we can definitely say is the density, the complexity of regulations have definitely increased. So now the European Commission presents us with a new ambitious project. It's called Bolder, Simpler and Faster Union. Now let us be honest, not all bureaucracy comes from Brussels. We all know this very well phenomenon of gold plating in many member states. They add often another layer of complexity. But at the very end, for citizens, it doesn't matter who is the culprit. They put everything in one pot. So don't start this game-blaming issue. And I would like to make clear that bureaucracy per se is not something which we can simply negate or we should always criticize. It can be a strength and it can be a strategic asset if it is made in a clear, workable, and a competitive way. And if citizens and business, and we will talk from that perspective very intensively later on, do not perceive it just as unclear rules, as overlapping regulations, a lot of reporting issues to be done, and in particular uncertainty about the framework in which they all operate. Now, bureaucracy definitely is not neutral. Larger organizations might be able to deal with complexity. They have their legal departments, they have their advisors, but who are really suffering are the small and medium-sized enterprises, and these, as we know, and Mr. Moritz, we are going to talk about that later on, is definitely the backbone of our European economy. Simplification, and this is a big topic we are going today, might help those who know the system, but this is then definitely not just cutting down bureaucracy, but just we are putting it further down the lane, and this is an issue which we as the Martens Centre, as the EPP family, are very much interested, because we consider ourselves as a party, as a political movement for small and medium-sized enterprises too. And we should not ignore one other topic. Some rules are complex, yes, but reality to a certain extent is complex as well. So look into climate policy, digital regulation, supply chain. These are issues ultra complex, and they deserve a certain degree of complexity also from a regulatory perspective. And it is not about the simple question as often put on the table, more Europe or less Europe. This is not the alternative. For me, it is an issue how Europe can better regulate, and that means in a clearer way, in a more proportionate way, and in a way it is workable in real life. These are some of the ideas, little stones I will throw into our discussions for today. I'm extremely delighted to have an excellent panel with me, which brings in different perspectives and different challenges. I will start with my dear colleague to the left, Mr. Rangeley from United Kingdom. I'm very happy to have you, Max, here with us. You are currently with the Martens Centre and also in different positions on advice. You bring in a lot of economic perspectives and even experience in UK, which is very helpful these days to look a bit from outside. Anthony, I'm very happy to have you with us. Anthony is, among us, many things, member of our academic council of the Martens Centre, and you have a long, decades-long expertise, definitely, in different international organizations on regulatory framework. And last but not least, Mr. Moritz, I'm very delighted to have you here as the Secretary General of the CEA. That means you represent European SMEs, and this is, as I alluded to, one of the institutions and the persons who feel first this huge burden. I'm equally delighted to have Federico, my dear colleague, with me. He will take over soon in moderating and sharing this session. Thank you, Federico, and all our interns, of course, for having prepared this issue. We are really overwhelmed by the participation rate that shows we hit something, apparently, and we are very delighted to have your insights as well. So I'm closing now with hoping that we have an open and a lively discussion. Bring in your perspective. This is a working lunch, and I think you had already prepared the basis of that. Happy to have you here. And Federico, now it's up to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter, for taking off my plate so much work, because you have already introduced the topic and the speakers, and I am grateful for it, for doing it so clearly and precisely. Welcome also from me to you all. I mean, we are overwhelmed by the amount of interest and participation that the topic engenders somehow. Maybe a little bit surprised even, but this is symptomatic, I have the feeling. A couple of years ago, a discussion like this would have been relatively technocratic in nature. No, we would have been discussing very specific policy details on how to improve the better regulation system here and there. But over the last years, it has become, I feel, much more political and strategic in importance, this agenda. And I think this is partly what is behind the widespread interest that it has provoked, because some of the most worrying outbursts, how shall we say, social outbursts of the last few years have been partly generated by perceptions about wrong regulations. Think about the Gilets jaunes in France, but even the farmers' protest more recently in Europe. So there is clearly a perception that this has now become much more political. And of course, the strategic environment in Europe and internationally, globally, has changed very much. So this better regulation agenda, the competitiveness agenda, is now of highly strategic importance, of high political salience. Maybe the only element of background that I add to what Peter said is that let's not forget that on February 12th, we have a competitiveness summit called, in which all the heads of state and government of the EU will participate. Also, Draghi and Letta will be present. And of course, in both of their reports, this issue of over-regulation and better regulation and regulatory simplification played a very important role. So without further ado, I suggest that we have the initial impulses of our three excellent panelists. They will help us understand where we are, whether these new efforts of the Commission have any chance of being more successful than the past efforts were. And then we can take it from there. We can have an exchange first on the panel, but do start, thinking about your own contributions, because this is a working lunch, it's a seminar, so everybody is really warmly invited. Many of you have lots of expertise, so to take the floor for comments or questions. So I suggest that we start maybe from Max for initial impulses. And so, Max, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. And we are actually living through quite an extraordinary period of history in that millennials are said to be the first generation in perhaps hundreds of years that will be poorer than their parents. And in fact, this is not just an anomaly. It's now looking like that will carry forward to the next generation, that is Generation Z. And in the UK, some people have said that this is the first time since the early 19th century this happened. But that actually was somewhat of an anomalous time. That was the end of the Napoleonic Wars and so on. I would argue it's actually the first time this has happened for hundreds of years, possibly even since the Renaissance, that we've had this situation where each generation is poorer than the previous generation and continuing onwards like this. Now, obviously, there are a number of different factors that have brought this about, but I do think the extraordinary amount of bureaucracy smothering innovation is one of the most important factors here. And if we look, for instance, at the different metrics for the cost of all of this bureaucracy, the European Commission, for instance, has said that the administrative burden is around 150 billion euros a year for the EU. That's just the administrative burden. So that's just the direct cost of people sitting around filling out forms, all of this type of stuff. Even then, that's an extraordinary underestimate. The OECD looked at the same, just the administrative burden, and came to the conclusion that it's 3 to 4% of GDP. So that would be somewhere between 500 to around 650 billion euros every year. But again, once we get beyond just the direct administrative burden, the cost of just filling out forms and this kind of stuff, it's actually significantly more than that. So there have been a number of different studies on this. One was by the National Association of Manufacturers in the US, who came to the conclusion that bureaucracy cost around 12% of GDP. A similar study was done in Britain around 2005 to 2006, and they came to roughly the same conclusion, around 10 to 12% of GDP is lost through bureaucracy. And a study not that long ago in Germany as well found that something like around 22% of the time of employees is taken up by dealing with bureaucracy. So it's really quite an extraordinary amount when you add this up for the entire European economy. And also, I should say, as you can probably hear from my accent, I'm here from Britain. I'm certainly not here preaching from Britain. Britain is actually one of the worst countries. I think Britain actually has the largest exodus of entrepreneurs of any country in the world at the moment. So I just wanted to establish that. But the question is then, if we do have this extraordinary amount of bureaucracy that is really cutting off a lot of innovation, how is this even sustainable? How are we even managing to have these stagnant living standards or even slightly falling living standards? And the answer is actually the also extraordinary increase in government debt, and actually debt in general, that we've seen over the last generation. That is what has propped up this system. And actually, we've done a number of books on this recently. This is one that I did with Annette, or rather I wrote a chapter for that with a British Member of Parliament, looking at some of these issues, on some of the consequences of this increase in debt. But what we've really seen across the developed world from the 1980s onwards is that central banks have responded to each recession by setting interest rates lower and lower, thereby generating a series of larger and larger debt bubbles. And again, this is not just in Europe, this is in the US. So for instance, in the US, when the debt bubbles of the late 1980s burst, Alan Greenspan set interest rates in the early 1990s at 3%. That was the lowest for decades. So that then created an even larger bubble, which was the dot-com bubble. Then when the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, the response was even lower interest rates of 1%, which then created an even larger bubble, the housing bubble. Now, of course, the European Central Bank came into being around this time, around 2000, I believe, and they very quickly joined in this trend, set interest rates very low, and of course created a series of extraordinary housing bubbles around Europe. Then when these bubbles in housing and other sectors burst in 2008, the response, of course, was even lower interest rates, years of 0% interest rates and even negative interest rates in Europe. And that has created an even larger debt bubble. And that, in essence, is what has sustained this bureaucracy, which has smothered innovation in Europe and elsewhere. So, for instance, when the 2008 crisis happened, the total amount of global aggregate debt was around $150 trillion. Now, that was already, by some margin, the largest debt bubble in history. Yet now, after years of 0% interest rates, global aggregate debt is more than $300 trillion, something like around $340 trillion. So since the 2008 crisis, policies like 0% interest rates have essentially doubled the size of the global debt bubble. And unfortunately, that will also be coming to an end, likely in the next 2 or 3 years. You can't really time these things, but it certainly will be coming to an end. And so that is actually, as we discuss bureaucracy today, we should bear that in mind, that we're living on borrowed time with all of this bureaucracy that's been created. Yes, it is. Yes, we've had stagnation, stagnant living standards in Western Europe for the last 20 years or so. But even that stagnation has been propped up by trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. And it's not just government debt. It's also, people going out and spending money on their credit cards is reported as quote unquote economic growth. So as my other panelists talk through more details on how we can reform these regulations, I do think that's an important aspect of this to bear in mind, that we really are living on borrowed time when it comes to this system being supported by these trillions of dollars of debt. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Max, for bringing a perspective that, perhaps listening to you, I was thinking that, our British friends were wrong to leave the EU, but some of their criticism of overregulation was perhaps not completely besides the point when they were within the EU. You mentioned an OECD study, and we have on the panel someone who knows the OECD inside out because he has been there for 15 years. And so I would like to ask perhaps next Anthony to give us his take on the state of play and the prospect of this new Commission's effort on better regulation.
Well, Federico, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, Tommy, and all the friends here at the Martens Centre. I'm coming, yes, more in my incarnation as a member of the Academic Council. I also have a role with the European Roundtable for Industry. But part of the reason that I want to come in my role as the Academic Council is that you also have to have a capacity to look critically at all of the actors involved. And we shouldn't think that anybody involved in policy making in any context and at any level is without responsibility. I hesitate to use the word blame. That sounds a little bit too heavy. Just as I was walking in, very interesting, I met someone, I remain nameless, delightful person, and who said, yes, my husband used to work on better regulation, then he took to alcohol. And of course, working on behalf of, the right purposes around, moderation, etc. But I just thought that was quite fun. Now, first thing, I'm amazed that there are so many people in this room, really. I'm delighted. And I'm trying to sort of think through myself, okay, what's the, what's happening here? And I think sort of one of the things that we have to get our heads around, firstly, is that there is a very sort of big transformation that has been happening, but now it's on turbo and it's on speed. When we use that word bureaucracy and regulation, it's sort of one of these generic things that can mean everything and nothing. What's happened on the European continent and a little bit beyond in the last decades is an exception in human history. Never have countries willingly come together and join together in order to operate in a whole host of areas, sometimes going as far as operating as one. Now, in order to do that, the only way you can do it is get common understanding. And common understanding means a common set of rules, a common set of concepts, a common set of elements that allow the disparate who started off at 6, who went to 9, who went to 12, who went to 15, and here we are at 27, actually managing to put all that stuff together. So sometimes I think we lose sight of the fact that, you know, it was only how long ago that Poland wasn't a member of the European Union? 2004. Poland has been growing at 4% a year since 2004 in the EU, with all the regulation and bureaucracy. And really, you're telling me that the only reason that they were growing at 4% nothing to do with being inside? So I say this because I think we need to think, we need to keep things in perspective very much in terms of why is it that there has been a focus and a natural focus in the construction of the European Union on putting a whole series of things together, because what people were doing was they were building something. And my old boss at the OECD, Angel Correa, used to say, the EU, it's sort of a project with lots of scaffolding, and there's always scaffolding around the, you know, the cathedral. And so it doesn't look very pretty. But actually, when you take it all away, it isn't at all as bad as you think. But there's that sort of element of the constancy and the critical elements around it. Now, in saying that, I think that we're at the point now where I'm certainly not saying that there isn't building that we have to do now, because there are a whole host of areas that we left to one side. Defense, absolutely not. Energy, must be joking. Telecoms, certainly not. All sorts of areas that were left out of the single market. And now everyone's going, what do you mean we left them out? We need to do this. Whose idea was it to leave it out? We can all know why those things happen. Now, I'm going to fast forward and basically say that in my sense and in my view now, the three elements that condition everything that we do, these are like three concentric circles: sustainability, competitiveness, and security. So in viewing this topic of better regulation, the influence of bureaucracy, bolder, simpler, and faster union, I think we have to look at everything through this prism. Now, that is not an easy thing to do, because I can give you the best case examples of the OECD recommending how to do better regulation. And at no point do they mention explicitly some of those concepts. People are talking about transparency, accountability, All of that, in a sense, is designed for a lovely world, peace and love. Brilliant. You know, a world where you don't have Putin over here, you don't have Xi over there, and you don't have Donald over there. We are in a very different world now. We're in a world where Europe, which from many respects and in many cases, people sort of looked at in a quite a benign way, and well, they're doing their thing over there, etc. And remember, it's 27 moving into 1, as opposed to 1 that suddenly Canada deciding that it has to remove barriers within Canada. Okay, so these guys are doing that, and it's only 1 country. When we look at sustainability, the competitiveness, and the security challenge, what I think the challenge that we've got is that, to my mind, sustainability ruled the roost. Certainly, I'm going to go back just as far as 2019. Keep it recent. That changes when security suddenly in early 2022, boom, Ukraine comes along, and that throws things rather. I wasn't in this town, and I don't know how quickly things evolve. I do know that suddenly the competitiveness agenda, which was probably something that people didn't really talk about too much, 2024, ooh, Letta, ooh, Draghi, and then suddenly that piece is very high. We fast forward a little bit further, everything that's happened with the United States, that some people would say, well, we'd never expected that to happen, although perhaps with a little bit of foresight, one might have at least been planning. Suddenly your security piece, where you had Ukraine, Russia was always, China was there and more understood in that economic and in that intelligence and security aspect. But then suddenly you have the challenge with the United States. So I think that what we're seeing now I'm quite hopeful about what we can actually manage to do, is that the competitiveness and security pieces of the concentric circle, those are the ones that are rising up, and they are mutually reinforcing. Why? My God, if you want to set up a defense industry that's worthy of the name today, do you need a single market? And if you need a single market in defense, I can tell you, all the other things that the ERT and other organizations complain about in the single market will melt away. Because the toughest thing to build a single market in is the one where you're existentially, you probably need it the most right now, okay? An industry, if you're thinking about, creating some sort of European SpaceX or things like that, and it's happening right now. Airbus, Thales, Leonardo, they're working on this stuff very, very quickly. Defense tech, my God, you can't move for European companies in that domain. So it's really fascinating stuff. So I see that there are imperatives now that are taking us in this direction. In terms of what I've seen happening in the last year, and I was lucky, I've connected back into the Brussels environment only a year ago, so I haven't lived, 10, 15, 20 years worth of, oh my God, nothing ever happens, and it's all sort of, your senses are dulled. I see what has happened, for example, in very quick time in a simplification agenda. Now, the difficulty is that there is no time. So there isn't time to deliberate too heavily. But there is a need for speed, and I think that what's happening right now in terms of the moves around certainly sustainability reporting, where the outcomes weren't being delivered, I see things changing. I think one of the things that's fundamental is the focus on outcomes. So when we think in terms of regulation, we have to be thinking in terms of outcome, we have to be thinking in terms of feasibility, doability, and we also have to be thinking in terms of what is the best way to achieve the outcome that we have. It can also mean, at the end of the day, that there is a deliberation around something where someone started out saying, we need a regulation, and the conclusion at the end of it may be that we do not. And it may also be the case that in areas that we felt that we didn't need a regulation, we now do. I can tell you that business is far more favorable to regulations in the EU sense of the word than directives. Why? Because directives have been horribly abused. Under the sort of thing of subsidiarity and all of this stuff, guess what? Everybody was hiding their gold in the single market, burying their treasure so that the neighbor couldn't have any. And we are losing half of the value of that single market right now. And that makes the figures that Max gave earlier pale into insignificance. It's massive what we can get out of the single market. If we get it, it isn't just important for our growth, which needs to be domestic now. We can't be export-led like we were. We need to be like the Americans. The Americans are domestic growth-led. The other piece of the jigsaw with that is that the leverage Europe is going to have with the rest of the world is going to grow exponentially. The more the value of our own market grows, the more access to it is valuable for everybody else, and that magnetic attraction. So I'm going to leave it there. Sorry if I've been a little bit long.
No, you were perfect. And I think one of the key questions when we started, for me at least, was, is this time different? I mean, is this effort going to be more successful than the previous one? And we start seeing some of the reasons why it might be different. Because as you said, for the first time now we have different agendas reinforcing each other and pushing us to be serious about better regulation, particularly competitiveness and security. I will now turn to Stefan. Because, I mean, the European Roundtable of Industrialists is more, can we say, big business, while I think most of the European economy is still SMEs, and so you are very close to this SME ecosystem, and you can give us a sense of how this all looks like from that corner. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got the honor to represent the German Mittelstand BW Association here in Brussels, and they also supported me in becoming the Secretary General of the European Entrepreneurs CEA-PME Confederation of SME Associations. So I speak here for the German and the European Mittelstand, possibly. That means, of course, Mittelstand, you said it, is 99.45% of all registered companies. Of course, not of the added value, only 50% more or less, but 2/3 of the employment anyway. we are talking about better regulation. Of course, it is the momentum, and the momentum comes from mainly, of course, the external threats, let's say, and the loss of position, loss of competitiveness, but that means loss of wealth. And most probably, it is becoming substantial. Not a little bit cyclical, but we are losing substantial positions in strategic industrial and economic areas. Especially, mainly, we are losing in the industry. Our confederation has launched in December a call to action to all the member states at the European Union to save our European industry. SOS European industry is our call. Of course, we have proposals there, concretely how we would do it. And one of these is, of course, let's say, bureaucratic burden and the reduction of it. But when we are talking about bureaucratic burden, the reduction of it, to be honest, we lost a little bit hope in the word better regulation. One of my fellow nationals, Mr. Stoiber, has already tried to do better regulation, you know that. And the result is that since 2015, I think he has stopped more or less his, or submitted his report since then. Since 2015, the European Union alone, without the member states, has produced until 2024 13,000 legal acts. The United States, in the same time, produced something like 5,000. Legal acts, of course, include all the secondary and tertiary legislative acts. That means implementation acts and so on. The delegated acts that the European Commission is using widely. For example, last year, 2025, the year when the Commission President announced to reduce by 25% the bureaucratic burden and 35% even for the SMEs. I mean, of course, they started with the omnibuses and they are not yet operative for the large part. But the Commission was anyway able to produce during the same year another 1,496 legal acts. That means 21 directives, 102 regulations, 133 delegated acts, and 1,196 tertiary implementation acts. So that means we are already, I got a little bit lost with the better regulation because, of course, we are always accused to say that we could, if you continue to say like this, we don't want deregulation, we only want simplification. Yeah. Can we agree on the fact that we don't call it deregulation, but that we call it the minimum necessary regulation, the minimal legislation? Why do we have to add up always something more? I can tell you that I think that this bureaucratic tsunami, like some of my members call it, has produced sometimes very, very bad outcomes. I can tell you, for example, very concretely, one mid-cap from our French member, which has also production installations in Germany. But they have in their product catalog something like 20,000 products, different. Yeah? In 2021, the medical devices regulation entered into force. Since then, half of their research and development department is filling out paper for the European Commission in order to document the fact that their medical devices are compliant with that regulation. And they had to fill out on all products which already had been approved before, because the medical devices regulation required a totally new approach, which meant questionnaires from between 20 and 200 pages for each single document. And that is 20 people in the R&D department, 10 of them working on that paper. Of course, they need people that have studied and have maybe also a PhD, because it's very complex to fill out these documents, and they cannot use some assistance, let's say. And that means these people cannot develop new products. So at the end, this produces, of course, loss of competitiveness, loss of added value, and loss of jobs at the end. And loss of jobs, if we focus especially on the industry, in Germany alone, in the last 2 years, we have seen every month approximately 100 SMEs and mid-caps shutting down. And if we also add up at the production facilities of the German industry, of the bigger players, we are losing every month 10,000 jobs in the industry. 10,000 jobs in the industry are not only some, let's say, pizza deliverers, and you cannot even reskill them like that. That is a substantial loss of know-how, of skills, of also capacity of spending capacity, because a worker in the industry is earning well. And if you expand that to the whole European Union and 27 member states, and of course there is Poland, of course there is Spain, thanks to the RRF, sorry. But then after that, let's say when you look at Italy and when you look at France and other let's say strong players, the industry in Europe is looking very bad. So what do we think is very much needed now to make a better regulation, or let's call it smarter or minimal regulation? I think the first thing, for example, could be a word that you did not say, but I think it's really important, is trust. Use trust. Use trust in your European member states. Use trust in your European citizens and companies. For example, why do we ask with CSRD European companies to write up that they apply European laws? Like scholars, like stupid pupils. Because the laws that the report that they have to report on contains questions regarding if they respect the laws regarding, I don't know, environmental laws for emission of to waters or air, and so on and so forth. Even labor laws, even the respect of human rights and equality and so on and so forth, which is all regulated in laws and contracts. Why do we ask them to write that? They are Europeans. They have to apply that. And it's of course clear that they do it. At least 99% do. There will be some black sheep, of course, but if they are, it is the responsibility of the member states to find that out and to check them, and in case to punish them. And if the member states don't apply the European laws, the European Commission and the European Union have enough tools to also provide for that the member state gets more conform with the agreed legislation. So that's the first thing. So I think, luckily also, the financial markets are not anymore asking for ESG. So if you want to have money on the financial markets, you don't need to even more and more or less and less you need to have ESG reports. So most probably it will be the friends from the ETI and from Business Europe, which sooner or later will tell us, do we really need CSRD? No. And we will be happy to say, yes, I also think we don't need that, because it's not about that we don't believe in doing everything possible against climate change. It's about, do we need to write it down every year that we would like to do it, or can we also invest our time in innovation and producing added value with which we can finance taxes and projects that might be useful to prevent damages from climate change. Of course, let's say trust is one first important thing. Let's say trust in our own legislation, in our in our peers. Second thing is, of course, there could be a series of detailed questions or solutions to improve legislation. I have not studied that topic, so I would not dare to talk about it, but I have asked AI, and AI has answered me with a list of quite good proposals. I mean, I can recommend and share that with you. I must say, for example, they say, why don't you limit the delegations in the legal acts and in the directives and regulations, that in order that the Commission cannot undertake so many delegated acts, or also put a sunset clause that they have to do it until, and if they don't do it, it's done. Also that they have to regularly consolidate the legislation and see how they can unite it in one single codex in order not to leave some documents around or some legal acts around. Or also that that there is a deadline, a day of ending the validity of this law. If it's not confirmed by the Parliament or by the Council, it will stop its validity. Very, very interesting things. Of course, you could also legiferate or govern, let's say, to have a governance with alternative instruments like guidelines, standards, and co-regulation. Important is, of course, also subsidiarity. I think you're right that, of course, the directives have been the tool for the member states to always somehow circumvent European legislation and to bury, like you said, Mr. Gooch, the gold under their own crown. But I think the time has come that many understand now that we cannot anymore treat our neighbors in Europe like as if they were the biggest competitors that we have. They are all losing ground against China especially, and they understand that we now have to make it easier for ourselves possibly. So let's say, said this, I would like to close with one last proposal, which makes me hope also that there is maybe a hope to that something changes. It comes not from me, but from a very important member of a cabinet of one of the current commissioners of the European Union, which is of the European Commission, which is in charge of this kind of topics, regulation, simplification, and so on. And he said, you know, in this house, people make career producing more legal acts. But we could also ask them to do exactly the same. That comes from another member, not cabinet, but a director of one of the commission of the Director Generals, and he said we could also promote the people on the basis of how many legal acts they have repealed or consolidated. And maybe this could become a model for managing the machinery, because that's very important. The machinery must be managed, and there must be an incentive of making things easier, faster, and bolder, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, because with your intervention, we already moved from the diagnosis to some of the concrete proposals on the therapy. You mentioned, of course, rightly delegated and implementing acts. We should remember that they are actually exempt from the better regulation agenda, as emergency decisions are. All the emergency decisions that were made, you know, for COVID or for Ukraine, they were also exempt from the better regulation agenda. So there is their loophole in the better regulation agenda. Also, legislative amendments are largely exempted. So the amendments to proposals of the Commission made by the Council and the Parliament. So these are technical things, but they are important, I think, within the better regulation agenda. I would suggest that you start thinking about your own comments and questions from the floor. And meanwhile, I will go maybe in reverse order on the therapy, because again, the diagnosis, more or less, we understood from oral you. We started to put on the table some concrete measures that can be taken. So what I would like now to ask maybe Anthony and then Max is what we are seeing enough, despite this new dynamism that you have described, Anthony? Is it enough? And if not, what concretely can we advise leaders to do? What concrete initiatives can be taken to fix this problem once and for all, or at least to improve the situation?
So I think the penny has dropped. I think we have woken up, we have smelt coffee. I think we are sort of getting out of bed. And so I think the biggest challenge that we've got is that what we probably should have been doing over a far longer period of time, we don't have time. Now, as we don't have time, and the European construction is based on consensus, and it's based on voluntary agreement, which is what has made it unique. We now, with those knives to the throat and guns to the head that I pointed out, My colleague was correct, Stefan, in talking about the external elements that sort of we need sometimes to really push us. This is, I think, where the thing becomes challenging. So I think one of the very important elements that I have actually seen in concrete terms happen. In all of my time following the European Union, and I was in the Commission for 15 years, I never remember a head of government citing a CS3D or CSRD or EU taxonomy directive. Until Macron and Moritz, they came out publicly and said, enough. I think they even used those words. You know, I don't have the German for it, ça suffit in French. But wow, I'm thinking, my God, at last. They haven't delegated. We talked about delegated acts, but we've got politicians delegating stuff. Why? Because they read regulation, bureaucracy. No, I need to talk about the sexy stuff. I'm the head of government, you know, I'm here to, whoa. And now, finally, we've got these people realizing that that is the existential stuff. Because wars are won by industries, battles are won by military. And it is existential stuff. And that's what it's taken. My German colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, for the Schwarze Null to have been got rid of. Serious stuff. And I am not underestimating policy decisions that have been taken for the reasons they were taken at a certain time. But we're in a situation now, I think, where time really is of the essence. So I think that the omnibus agenda that the Commission has taken forward, they've taken it forward fast. For some, too fast. From my perspective, it's okay. Is the ECJ going to take them to, you know, they're going to get tied up in knots by the ECJ? I don't know. I know that the European Parliament is already trying to tie up the Mercosur agreement, which has only taken a small matter of 30 years. It's taken that one over there. Now, I think one of the things that we need is the same, what I would call prise de conscience, which I feel is now prevalent in the vast majority of the European Council. The vast majority now. I think it really is, you can count them on the fingers of one hand, heads of government who might be a little bit And the solution in the Council is there. It's called enhanced cooperation. It only takes 9 member states to move. So all this stuff about we need unanimity and we need everybody to agree, rubbish. You have loads of flexibility if you want to use it, and you have great lawyers who find great flexibility. The heads of the legal service of the Council and the Commission, I can tell you, I've worked very directly with many of these people. Where there is a will, there is a way. So political will is fundamental. I've got a big question mark about the European Parliament. And I know that there are former parliamentarians here and very current. And that's the one where I think there is work to do. And I think that everyone has to sort of contribute to that work. Why? Because we're talking about the co-legislators. Remember, the Commission proposes things. The Commission always does a risk assessment. Do I think that they're great? I think risk assessments are okay sometimes. I think the really important thing to do with any piece of regulation is what you do 2 years afterwards. Why? Did it do what it said on the box? First time I learned this was at the OECD, the Chilean Parliament. Chileans joined the OECD in 2010 and they taught us. They said, organ transplant law. 2 years later, we did an ex post evaluation of the law. We changed a number of things because it wasn't doing what we wanted it to do. Ex post evaluation of law should be what the European Parliament gets into. I agree with Stefan. MEPs should be ranked by Politico and any other people who do rankings on their contribution to simplification, their contribution to unwinding things that maybe at a certain time they were what was needed, but the times have changed. So co-legislators, council, not delegate up. The European Council has to take the decisions. The European Council by 2028 has to sit down and do a big bang on the single market. What do I mean? Everybody knows where the treasure's buried at home. Everybody knows the gold-plated directives that they're using for certain reasons. Sometimes, I'll be very honest, there are industry people behind them, okay? And we have to also smoke them out a little bit. That's why I'm speaking here as the academic council. I particularly want to lose my job. But everybody has to play this game. And I lived this at the OECD, the tax reform at the OECD. Everybody was at it. the double Dutch, the Irish, everybody, the Brits, the Americans, Delaware. At a certain point, my old boss used to say, gypsies shouldn't read each other's palms. We are all at it. So let's cut the crap, put it all on the table, and recognize and realize that we are currently playing second division football, all of us. And there's China and there's the US that are in the Champions League of the economy and many other things. And we cannot afford to be in the second division, because when they come and play us, they will blow us away 25-0. And if there are still 11 men on the pitch or women, it'd be a bloody miracle. So what we need to do is we need to play Champions League. And in order to play Champions League, we need to come together on a whole host of things. And when I say that from the economic perspective and from the rational perspective. I'm not talking theology at all here. It's realistic. Play what is in front of you. Recognize the situation that we are in right now. There are also areas that I will say where I'm talking about getting rid of barriers, getting rid of the gold plating on the single market. Absolutely. That is an agenda that is existential and fundamental, and we cannot afford not to, because that's where our growth is going to come to. We can't get growth from other places. It's very hard, and that's the lever that we need. When they get nasty from China and they get nasty from the US, we have stuff also that we can leverage. There are areas where we are going to have to regulate. And why? Just for fun, I was noting something down. There is something that we haven't done. It's called a capital markets union. As a consequence, we have 400 billion a year that's going to America and that's doing brilliantly for the American economy. And meanwhile, we're going, oh my God, where are we going to get the money and all the debt and the infrastructure, oh dear, etc. As it happens right now, let's look at something. When we look at capital markets, do you know how many trading venues there are in the European Union? 295. Do you know how many central counterparties there are in the European Union? 14. Do you know how many central security depositories there are in the European Union? 32. In the US, they have 2 securities clearing houses and 1 central security deposit. Now that is cutting bureaucracy. Ooh, big time. But let's remember something. That is a moment where you're going to get trouble when you go down into the member states. And even in the Länder or the regions or the Comunidad Autónoma, you choose. Why? Because it's jobs and it's, I quite like my BaFin in Germany. I'm the best regulator. Can't trust those French and the Brits and anybody else. Guys, come on. What are we playing at? Look at something. I tell you, the best example for me, and I never thought this would happen as a former Commission official, the member states of the EU would tell the Commission to procure the vaccine, and the Medicines Evaluation Agency, a European agency to deal with life and death, you're the ones who approve whether it's okay or not. The member states, excuse my French, all got under the table. You couldn't see them for love nor money. They said, Commission, you do it. Medicines Evaluation, you do it. Why? If there's a problem, it's your fault. The Medicines Evaluation did it. No problems in Europe to speak of. The procurement by the Commission, I set aside the WhatsApps and the rest. The value for money, if you look at what the United Kingdom paid for vaccines, or Israel or many other countries paid relative to, that was quite something.
Anthony, that was a very powerful plea, forward-looking one. I already have Tommy on my list. I will get to Max now for his ideas on what to do, but I invite all of you who would have questions or comments to signal it to me in some form. Like raise your hand, so that I can see and write down on my paper. Yeah, thank you. So Max first, and then we start taking questions.
Thank you, Federico. Yes, so I'll talk about a few points quickly that could be applied here so that we can start to reduce some of this bureaucracy and have a more innovative economy. And this applies also to other countries like the UK as well, which are incredibly bureaucratic. Now, first of all, when it comes to any decision-making, establishing the cost of what you're doing is always going to be an important factor. That, in essence, is the beginning of decision-making. Whether you're deciding whether to set up a business, what investment to do, or even just where to go on holiday this year, what you do intuitively is some form of cost-benefit analysis. Now, so when the European Commission talks about the cost of regulation and bureaucracy, as being, as I talked about earlier, 150 billion euros a year. This is really no. This is according to the Commission. This is for the whole of Europe. But again, they're just looking at the administrative burden, so just the direct cost of people sitting around filling out forms. Again, this is really just the very beginning of the cost of bureaucracy. What there also is delays in products being rolled out, completely lost investment opportunities. There's, of course, entrepreneurs moving abroad to other parts of the world where there's fewer regulations. All of this is a total loss to the European economy. So I think the beginning of progress will be actually, let's say, a more comprehensive effort to look at the costs of all of this bureaucracy. I mentioned earlier, for instance, the American National Association of Manufacturers in the US, who said that even in the US, the cost of federal regulations is something around 12% of GDP. So that's what we're talking about here. That's also incidentally something that the best practice countries, as the OECD talks about, tend to do, is they tend to look at these indirect costs of regulation as well as just the direct administrative costs. Second, then, another equally important aspect is when you're looking at new regulations in the EU and many other countries for that matter, they tend to just look at the incremental cost of each of these extra regulations when they're doing cost-benefit analysis. Whereas in actual fact, what should really be looked at is the total accumulated regulations so far, because that's where things really become so heavily bureaucratic that we end up in this situation of essentially intergenerational stagnation for the first time in centuries. So, if you were to look at the regulations that are being produced, some of them may seem quite reasonable. You may think, well, why not just have a little regulation on telling people what font size they have to have on their packaging, all this kind of stuff. But by the time you get through to the hundreds of thousands of pages of regulation, and it's all accumulated over years, that's when it begins to really strangle the economy. Now, there's one other point I wanted to touch on here, specifically with regard to defense, which I think is an incredibly important issue, not just with regard to the situation with Russia, but actually just in general. And I think this period that we're moving into is also going to see a transformation in the nature of defense and warfare. And incidentally, I mentioned this book that we've done on banking and debt. I've just finished a book with Lord Fairfax in the UK to be published by Springer Nature on artificial intelligence. So this is a peer-reviewed academic book, not just a pamphlet or something. And we've invited many of the top experts around the world to write chapters. And we have a whole section in this book on defense and security. Chapters from former chief of the defense staff, the RAND Corporation, defense contractors, many of the top people in the world on this issue. And we are, in fact, moving into a period of a radical shift in the nature of warfare with robotics and drones. What you see in Ukraine with drones just dropping grenades on people is just the very beginning. In fact, in just a few years, people will look back and that will seem incredibly crude. I don't know if you noticed, but in China, just in the last couple of months or so, they announced that humanoid robots will be patrolling the border with Vietnam. We're going to see more and more of these types of announcements. And in essence, what we've done with a lot of this over-regulation is ensure that just more and more of this manufacturing is done abroad rather than in Europe. So much of our drone manufacturing and so on has been exported to China. I think in years to come, when we look at how the nature of defense and warfare is going to change, that will be regarded as a very significant error, unfortunately.
Thank you, Max. I already have 2 people on my list. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Wow. I would say that then we start taking maybe 3 questions first. We go back to the panel, allow them to answer, and then we take another round of questions. So, Tommy, please.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to go back, put the discussion in the political context in the bubble where we are here. So first of all, a lot of this discussion stems from the last European elections, 2024, where you had this very quick change of rhetorics, new election results. You had this accent on competitiveness and as a result to discussion on regulation. But of course, the reality is that the machinery, the Commission, was producing already products much related to the whole Green Deal initiative, which were coming up. So there was a mismatch, in fact, that there's a new expectations and then there was a functional reality. And maybe my question is that how do you see now the political discussion and context? Because what we see here when we speak about better regulation or deregulation, we understand it somehow positively. I do understand. But in fact, because it's relation to the new Green Deal, it is actually in many circles there toxic word. And that's part of the problem, because especially in the context of Green Deal, now this deregulation is seen as scaling back from the commitments we had to renewing economy and all of that, and so that complicates the discussion. How do you see that? And then maybe lastly, how we see how is this discussion changing? Does it have an impact on how Commission operates? How sure it does, but how long it will take? Do we see that only we are in the right position in 2 to 3 years when in fact we are already entering the next European elections?
Tommy, there was a gentleman here, I believe. Yes. Maybe if you could just say who you are, just to identify yourself.
Hi. Would you mind using the microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought my voice was loud enough. Hi, Brian Chesler from Edana. So I just had a question. How do we cajole the individual member states to go along with this? What has worked in the past, and can we rely upon that, going into the future? Thank you.
I think we take one more, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Papa. I was in the Commission for 30 years, mainly in the external service, and I was writing draft law myself in anti-dumping procedures. So I know the difficulty of doing the wording even for laws as such. I have a problem with the quantification of bureaucracy. All speakers brought up numbers of legal acts. I don't see all the legal acts being part of bureaucracy. I don't think we can quantify bureaucracy just by legal acts. I think we have to see, for instance, how many officials are working to enforce or implement these. And there the Commission is very low staffed, I say, in comparison particularly to the member states' national administrations. I don't want to defend the Commission, and I don't want to defend at all bureaucracy as such. Very much I'm against it. I'm working now on issues of global governance, which is a higher level even than the EU, and I see a lot of problems in the United Nations, for instance, how difficult it is to get consensus, and the EU is trying to get beyond the consensus building, although in the Council we still have more or less 80% of consensus for any legislation that is passed. So my main problem is this quantification for one thing. Yeah. And I want to remember that we are in Europe on the continent, and I'm sorry for all the Anglo-Saxons here, very much formed by the idea of precautionary principle. It wasn't mentioned at all here, but that's a very basic understanding. For stable societies, we need this. And this, in contrast, dare I say, to the United States in particular. I have some experience in Japan and China, but I don't want to compare that here because we are focusing on the EU.
Thank you. That's very clear, and that's a very fair question. So I suggest that we quickly go back to the panel now, and we address these three issues of better regulation as toxic, in a way, how to frame better regulation so that it flies, if I understood Tommy correctly, how to cajole the member states to follow, how to quantify bureaucracy, and that's a very technical and real problem, I think. So maybe we can start from Stefan and then go in reverse order.
Yeah, for the question regarding the how we could move the member states to do more. I think there's quite good opportunity now, window of opportunity. First of all, the concept of gold plating is now getting really a public domain, and we will engage on a member states level with our member associations in that field, and let's say show, thanks also to AI, because otherwise you have to do a study which takes years, to show simply with some samples and examples how much the member states put on top of the European legislation. And that would most probably also trigger then interest also the media, and could also move some political decisions then. Secondly, I think also we have this window of opportunity because we have a majority of center-right governments in the European Council, and why should the colleagues from the same party not agree finally on doing, let's say, harmonization as by design? So let's say if we do something, it must be immediately harmonized with the European legislation and with what our partners do in order to open to our businesses all borders inside the European Union. For what regards to the quantification of bureaucracy, of course, it's also a question of quality, and you said it with a precautionary principle, aftercare and pre-care. No? We had this when Mr. Gooch knows it well, when we talked about TTIP, the discussion between aftercare in the US and pre-care in Europe, 5 years before you get a product on the market, even more sometimes. Some of our members complained about that, and in the United States, it's quite easier, but the responsibility is higher. That's the point. Trust and responsibility. Responsibility not only for those who might do wrong things, also, for example, introduce products on the market which harm people or nature, or people or nature, but also responsibility of the legislators, because many of the legal acts that we are talking about have been done by the legislators because they want to push responsibility to the next level, to an insurance or to another decision-making body or whatever. Yeah? And finally, I would also come back to the, unfortunately, not to your question, but to the point regarding the capital union. And I would say capital union and banking union go together, of course, but banking union, and that's, that's in the services sector, the single market does not work. It does even less work than in the goods, in the sector of goods. And we talk here about, or the OECD study talked about 110% of customs, let's say. Why? Because it's the whole sector of notaries, tax consultants, and lawyers which don't want to open markets. And why is that a problem for us as companies, I say? Because 99% of companies are small, medium-sized enterprises. The vast majority of them are not listed on stock markets. So they don't go to the financial markets to get money. They go to the bank, to the house bank, to the commercial banks. And what do the commercial banks want? Collaterals. They want a piece of land, a factory, or even your house. Yeah? And these things can only be guaranteed and be accessible for the banks inside the legal system of the single member state. So only lawyers and notaries and tax consultants of that country can access and use that. Yeah? And that's the big problem, because that hinders the whole banking union, and that with that the capital union. So think of it, because we must move these people to finally accept competition. And I can tell you it will happen, because a colleague of mine, a young entrepreneur, which now just he founded a company in Estonia with e-residency, and the notary costs only 600 euro for the foundation, and the tax consultant costs 1,200 a year. That's very cheap, that's very good. And he said, okay, I'm now an Estonian company. Thank you. And competition will help, hopefully.
Thank you. Maybe, Anthony, you could focus on the question that remained unanswered, Tommy's question about the framing in a way. I mean, this is also the reason, by the way, why deregulation is a dirty word, because the leaders understand that, I mean, you are right, it is probably necessary if you want to tackle the stock, but simplification is more reassuring than deregulation. And so this goes back to what Tommy was raising. And
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, Tommy, and it's basically a bit of schizophrenia. It's, you march people up a hill, you tell them the hill is the Green Deal, and then suddenly, at the top they all realize, oh shit, turn around, you've got to march in another direction. And the top is talking a good game. The top isn't sure about quite how to do it because the implementation of much of what's required on competitiveness, it's not the natural function of many of those in those roles. And that's where a partnership, I think, with business and with industry is essential. And I see a very important role there for business, industry, big, small, to partner. But part of the problem we have there is that at the moment that happens, people are talking about revolving doors and people are up to no good and there's something funny going on. I've detected that 30 years in the public domain, and I'm in the industry domain primarily. And I think that lack of trust that Stefan was alluding to is something that we have to overcome because I don't see it. I think a big challenge, I think, also is actually shifting regulation towards facilitation and away from prohibition, making things possible. So that would be a big emphasis that I would place now. What do I mean by that? A lot of collaboration is necessary for innovation. Collaboration. That doesn't mean cartel. That doesn't mean price fixing, all of those things. But all of our rules are a little bit hardwired for that very competitive environment where everyone's got, the knife between their teeth and they're competing till the cows come home. So I see a change needed there. But specifically to the point, there are many areas where the sustainability concentric circle that I talked about and the competitiveness concentric circle and security come together. Clean tech, electrification, unhealthy dependencies. We do not want to be depending on energy sources that are not coming from Europe. So that for us means it's a no-brainer. The renewables, the electrification has to be what we do. We have to do it as quickly as we possibly can. That requires a lot of investment. Actually, I think that's an agenda that people in certain parts of the European Parliament, if you like, the EPP is the big centre. I don't call it centre-right. The EPP is the big centre. It's the people on the sort of left of that channel that I think need to understand how the competitiveness and sustainability agenda actually intersect and come together. But they also need to understand another thing where the security thing comes up, which is you cannot defend yourself if you don't have a steel industry, if you don't have a chemicals industry, if you don't have an aluminium industry, and you're relying, because the dirty little secret I think was, let's let the rest of the world do that. We're pure, we're lovely, we've got 6% emissions, we're going to take it down to 0, and it'll be done somewhere else. And yes, we'll help them, of course, we'll give them money, but we don't do it ourselves. Guess what? We can't do that anymore. That's a very unhealthy dependency, not to make any steel anymore. Okay, so I think that needs to be worked on. But we are, I think, in working through this schizophrenia right now. The biggest challenge, as I said, I think, is the one in the political realm, where I think it's too old style, them and us. When people who are sort of standing on principle on certain things and finding it really hard to say, actually, God, yes, it's true. When the facts change, I change. For them politically, I think that's hard. So I think that there are political groupings that need to rework their purpose and not feel that there's no reason for them to exist anymore, but they have to adjust to a new world. And if they don't, of course, in the European Parliament, there are other political forces in the European Parliament that are quite sizable and that seem to be rather happy to go along with a number of these agenda points as well.
Thanks, Anthony. Max, if you allow me, what I will suggest to do, because there are many questions, is that I take them and then I get back to you for the first answer. Because, when there is so much participation, it's a very good sign, and I don't want to quash it. Yes. So please, the lady over there.
My name is I'm from Amsterdam, the American Chamber of Commerce in Belgium, not EU, so I slightly feel the outsider here in the room today. But as mentioned, all the EU decision directive needs to be implemented in our country. And Belgium has been the champion of gold plating, by the way. Now my question is a bit candid, has literally declined, but I entered in the room and attended the invitation, thinking that better regulation was not only better regulation by the regulator, but also better regulation with the private sector. And my question is whether you think that there is room for self or better co-regulation with the private sector. And that kind of goes back to the concept of trust. Do we trust that the private sector can be trusted partners, can take part of the regulation with accountability mechanism, and actually, so we can do that together and not one against the other?
Thank you. That's clear and important. There was, oh, Madame Godard.
Yes, I'm Annette Godard. I'm looking for Mises Institute Europe. It's more a general question to Mr. Gooch. What you are suggesting is that you want to have a central superstate or create one. And what we did was actually centralizing, or what in the EU happened, was centralizing at the inside instead of the outside. So where we really should be strong and united is defense and foreign policy, immigration, also environment and the four freedoms, of course. But inside, it should be more diverse and not trying to put all the noses to the very same direction. And Hayek said once, and that is something that is always valid, that we have at low level the knowledge of time and place and not centralized knowledge. And I think that because all those countries have difficulties to accept a common point, leave them a little bit in freedom. But the core and towards the outside world, that should be strong.
Okay, that's clear. In the interest of time, I would ask all of you, because I really would like to give all of you the floor to ask. Yeah, there are quite a few people, and so just be short. I mean, just get to your point rapidly if you can. Yes, the lady over there.
Yes, I will try to be fast, even though there's 3 points I would like to address. But first of all, maybe more directly to Stefan, is are we aware of how bad the situation is in terms of company closures and job losses? Because as we mentioned, good policy making and regulation not only needs to be based on a cost assessment, but actual functional assessment of how the situation is. My second question is that has been addressed a little bit already, but
Yes.
About 10 years ago, we had a better regulation commissioner, Frans Timmermans, converted to saving the climate. And he always said the EU has to be big on big things, small on small things. Now, look, at the moment there's a consensus that the EU has gone too far, and I'm sure that they get somewhere in reducing this. But I mean, in order to structurally improve it, you have to wonder when was the EU big on small things, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that in the 80s they scrapped veto powers in a single European Act, or they started to scrap veto powers, whereby it basically became too easy to agree new EU regulations. So I think to make a structural, sustainable change, we need to change something there. Of course, changing the treaty is very difficult, but there could be some kind of a Luxembourg compromise style, deal between governments to, from now on, no longer use QMV in order to, stop this excesses that we have been witnessing.
It will certainly be seen as a provocative idea in EPP circles, but a fair one to be discussed. Please, the last question, I believe, there is you as well. No, please, go ahead. Yes.
So about better regulation and a question which is probably a wide elephant. If you want to reduce regulation, you have to cut government spending on the personnel. If you're looking, for example, on the quota, how many people are working government related, this has literally increased over the last 20 years in countries like France, right now 60%, Austria, my home country, 56%. There's literally 3 countries in the Union, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, and the third I forgot, which have decreased spendings on governmental costs on who is working in administration. I'm not advocating for this Elon Musk approach of Doge, of literally just throwing people out and everything. But if we take AI kind of serious in terms of it is about to standardize administration, to digitize stuff, that might be literally an approach we could easily tackle, which could also find some ways forward. And a very last remark on the famous EPP party, which is gloriously failed just last week on Mercosur, where the friends from France and Hungary and Poland have not been part of that family. I'm not so sure it's just a party question, but more of a general approach of if you want to take it serious, yes, we have to cut costs of that personnel.
Thank you. So I suggest that we start for Max because he did not have the chance to reply to the previous questions. You can pick and choose what seems.
Certainly, thanks. Yes, so I think first I'll address the lady's question about good regulations. And of course, there are good regulations. When we talk about the cost of bureaucracy, the baseline that we're comparing it to is not just anarchy and everyone gets to do what they want. But it is an important question here, which is how do we create some type of baseline for good regulations? And we can say everything over and above that is bureaucracy, which is just slowing down innovation. Now, it's also worth bearing in mind, let's say you have the baseline amount of regulation. You may have a load of regulation which is essentially pointless and just bureaucratic, but there's also a layer of regulation where it's actually counterproductive. If you have thousands of pages of regulations for some aspect of safety, and perhaps only 50 of them are useful, then in the end, many entrepreneurs can't see the wood for the trees at that point. But there have been, if we think about the studies that have been done, for instance, on this, there was some economists in the US who looked at the cost of regulation, and using that data, people estimated that all the regulations added to the US from roughly the end of World War II onwards, without those, the US would have been roughly twice as wealthy. These 2 economists said it was Dawson and Sita, incidentally. They said the US would be roughly 25% wealthier. Other people used the same data to say America would be twice as wealthy. Even some others said that the US total GDP would be 3 times as high. But the baseline they used was to say, imagine if all regulation had stopped in 1949 and nothing had changed since then. But that's probably, I think that's not a good approach, because I think we can agree there's probably been some good regulations implemented since then. So another way of looking at this is to look at best practice countries and see what they're doing. And so to take an example of this, a country that's frequently cited, it's always close to the top or at the top of the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, the OECD Index, and these types of groups is Singapore. And when Singapore became independent in roughly 1960, its GDP per capita was roughly the same as Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. And now its GDP per capita is well over $90,000 a year. In other words, roughly double what it is in Western Europe. So I think that's really a good way of assessing what are the baseline for these are good regulations, and everything over and above that is bureaucratic cost to the economy. That also gives us some indication as to the level of prosperity that can be achieved if we actually have smarter, simpler regulations rather than many hundreds of thousands of pages. And just very quickly then, the question from the other lady on working with the private sector. I think, yes, that's also incredibly important here. And that's a good way of achieving what we want, which is more innovation-friendly regulations in so much as they exist. But I think it's also important that it has to be small businesses, because what we see a lot of is consultations with big businesses. And contrary to how it's often presented, big businesses in general do not want deregulation. What big businesses often want is more regulation. They want regulation to suit them, and they want to use that regulation to keep out their competitors. And that happens not just here in Brussels, of course, but in Washington, in London, and elsewhere. So I think that's one of the most important things that can be done here is more involvement of small business.
Thanks, Max. We have big business at the table who will be able to reply now, but I would ask you, Anthony, to focus on Madame Godard's question, more internal diversity, and also on the veto powers question. Do we need more veto powers? I mean, more member states' vetoes to reduce regulations? And then the last two questions are for Stefan. And you have 2 minutes. I know it will be hard, but...
Okay. So I just really important point. I think that none of the companies of the European Roundtable for Industry can do what they do without small and medium-sized enterprises. None of them. So I can guarantee you that they all work with ecosystems. And the SME around any major company, the SME networks are extraordinary. So when we're looking, for example, at sustainability reporting, actually, the main thing that was done on Omnibus 1 was for SMEs, and that is of benefit to the bigger companies. There was a little bit more that would have been wished for from the bigger part, but I'll say I think the SMEs are very, very well represented in the Brussels space. SME United. Veronique Willems is fantastic, and we work very, very well together. But I wouldn't want you to come away thinking, wow, there's big business over here, and there's the SMEs over there, and never the twain shall meet. Certainly, that's not the experience that we have from our vantage point. I didn't. You used a term which I never used, and I deliberately said I am not here talking theological. I do not want to get into those spaces of people talking about treaties and people talking about, what's the ultimate this and the ultimate that. I'm saying, let's play what's in front of us. What is in front of us is the world of today. It is the world of 2026. It's a world where artificial intelligence is being cited so much. And I wonder if all of those notaries at national and other levels are going to survive AI. Because that stuff, I think, is going to be the stuff that may actually really do for them, rather than some decision which is to, I don't know, centralize necessarily. But as the subject is a subject around bureaucracy, etc., we have to be mindful of the fact that sometimes we duplicate a lot. Sometimes we have, on certain things, do we need 27 regulators? We have to ask those questions honestly. But then I'm not asking it ideologically. I'm not saying that it's something to do with, taking away. I'm saying, does it make sense? Can we look at it from a common sense perspective? Can we address things on a case-by-case basis and look at what we need and look at the costs as well? but also the risks that we run, because I genuinely think that that is something that we need to look at. Winston Churchill may surprise us, but Winston Churchill in 1940, do you know what he proposed? The fusion of the United Kingdom and France. Churchill. Why? Well, we all know where we were in 1940. Now, we will agree perhaps we're not in 1940 yet. I don't know how far we are, actually. I'm not quite sure. What's it going to take? Is it going to take someone to start rolling tanks in somewhere? I'm not really sure. But I remember the last time tanks were rolled in, I don't remember borders being very effective. I think what was effective was sea, and there was a lot of luck involved as well. So I think part of what we need to do, certainly I agree on things like defence. I don't agree at all on foreign policy. I don't want us to try and have common positions on what's happening in Sudan and every single place in the world. I think that is if we can get our proverbial SHIT together on defence, that is the most fundamental thing, because it's existential for us as Europeans. And we cited the 4 freedoms. Obviously, one of those freedoms is the free movement of people. But we know that that is an issue that politically and in terms of lived experience has become really challenging. So I think it's also one that we have to look at there from the perspective of lived experience by our citizens to see what doses are reasonable.
Thank you. Any last final thoughts that you would like to share, Stefan? But very shortly on the last 2 questions, 1 minute.
No, the question, are we aware about the loss of jobs, especially in the industry? I don't know. I am. I hope that many are, especially in this room. But I would wish that our friends from the Social Democrats would even be more aware. Yeah, data terms I cannot tell you, but maybe, and even also the media maybe should know better and talk more about that, because nowadays losing a job in the industry, that means roughly €3,000 of monthly income, which is very good, but you cannot replace that, not in the care system, not in the delivery system sector. So. I think that is very important, because that would make us also move, because that moves political consciousness and votes, and that's the key for everything.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are more or less on time. I would like to thank you all for your questions and very active participation. Maybe the only final thing that I will say, we had a regulatory ecosystem. We will need to have a deregulatory ecosystem as well. I mean, it's pointless to blame the EU. We heard that gold-plating is member states. We heard that business has their fair share of blame as well. So if we want this effort at better regulation to be successful, it will have to be a multi-level effort done cooperatively with all the relevant stakeholders. So we should resist the tendency to blame the EU only for this. Thank you very much. And you can continue also with our speakers after the end of the event. Thanks a lot.